There's a few important outcomes about the War of 1812 that need to be talked about. The first is that the final battle of the war actually occurred after the peace treaty was signed. Remember that it's 6 weeks on a ship to get back over to the United States. So the treaty was signed. It hadn't been ratified yet. And at the time, Andrew Jackson was moving into the South to New Orleans. And there's a major battle there called the Battle of New Orleans, right around 1815. Mid-January 1815. The Battle of New Orleans was a huge lopsided victory for Jackson and the Americans. Almost 3,000 British soldiers were killed or wounded, and 13 Americans were. Partially, this was because of the way that the Americans were able to dig in and fortify. But this is important for a couple of reasons. One, it was this wave of patriotic nationalism, plus the lopsided victory meant that both the British and the Americans were going to sign that peace treaty. The Americans were desperate to do it anyways. This just kind of convinced the British to move along faster. The second reason this is important is because Andrew Jackson becomes a war hero. And it's going to eventually propel him into the presidency. Another important thing that comes out of the War of 1812 is the death of the Federalist political party. This emerges during what's known as the Hartford Convention. This is where a lot of those New England states, specifically Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Vermont, and New Hampshire, tried to do things to get out of the war, which had been unpopular until the very end. And they were trying to limit the Republican influence over the government, mostly Southern Republican influence. They proposed 7 different amendments. All of them were designed to eliminate Southern influence. One of them, for example, was to remove the 3/5 compromise from population determination. There was also some talk of secession of New England. None of this went anywhere because when the delegation from the Hartford Convention got to Washington, that was right as the time the Battle of New Orleans information was coming, and what had looked like a pretty straightforward case against the war turned out to be an embarrassment for the Hartford Convention because the war was over, we had this massive victory, and now it didn't look good for the Federalists. So the big important thing that comes out of War of 1812, it is this wave of patriotism across the country. The Republicans are stronger now. They start to flip their political positions, though. The Republicans, who had been led by Jefferson and didn't believe in a standing army and didn't trust a strong military because it could provoke tyranny, now wanted a stronger standing army so that if there was a time of national defense necessary again, it would be there. Also, the Jeffersonian Republicans had been against the National Bank, but now, because of the difficulty of financing the war and the problems with the state banks, now they were willing to accept a national bank, and Madison in 1816 authorizes the Second Bank of the United States. And they began to see the value of industrialization and merchant class people. These new merchants demanded new tariffs that would protect their new industries, something that the Republicans had previously not been supportive of. Now they were. One last note is that now the United States is going to be able to expand into the West. The Native Americans lost their ally in the British. They lost their supply centers, which was what the British forts were. They're going to be forced into a radically different situation now. And as the Americans move into the West, they're going to be pushing the Native Americans away. Also important in this note is that slavery is going to be expanding into the West. And we're going to see that the conflicts that lead to the Civil War are going to come from that growth of slavery into the new Western territories.